Yep, those are done. Sure.
For the internship,
Uh-huh.
I was asked if I could start in the holidays. Is that okay?
Yep, you can start whenever works for you and your supervisor. And count those hours.
That's what I was gonna ask.
Yes, definitely.
I'm already working for starting.
All right.
It really was right. It really was. I thought it was
All right, I'm just gonna take attendance real quick and then we will go ahead and get started talking about. Today is just gonna be explaining what the heck is going on. So that everyone's on the same page.
I might have to book you. I'm trying to do.
Okay. Alrighty, so I'm gonna start by getting us acquainted where all the stuff is that you'll need for this on Blackboard. So if you go into our course, and I moved it up so it's easier to find, right up here, there is a section called Defining the Mind. And if you go to that, you'll see the how to react that I sent you all with your assignments yesterday, and then the game book. I was going to send this out as an attachment, but it's 132 pages, and I wanted to make sure you guys actually got the emails. So it's just posted here instead. And this is something to skim and look for the stuff related to your person, if that makes sense. So we're gonna go over that and our assignments related to this as we go through everything. So all of this is under defining the mind. And this is where you will turn in all the assignments for everything. I have to still make a table of who has what character for you to refer to. Also, if you want to look at the game book in more digestible sections, they are here.
So are you assigned this?
Yeah, so you should have gotten an email from me yesterday with it. And if you didn't, then shoot me an email and I'll resend it. And your character role sheet that I sent to each of you yesterday, that's just for you. Don't share that with anybody because there might be some stuff that's like secret in that. So this is a simulation. It's this is a whole world called Reacting to the Past. I've actually been to a conference for this before. It was actually kind of fun. At the conference, they made the professors play the games, so we knew what it was like for y'all. And so I have been there. I have experienced it. And so I'm glad to share my experiences as well. So the idea and the rationale behind this teaching technique is that you learn more and hopefully have more fun when you immerse yourself into a person who existed in the past. So all of the characters that y'all were assigned are real people who were interacting back then. So I'm gonna scroll down here. So this particular game does have take some historical liberties, we'll put it that way. So basically, to make it something that interacted a little more, the author combined the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association. So you'll have both psychologists and psychiatrists. That being said, everything that you will see that happens during this game that's described really happened. So intellectual conflicts in the 70s. I love that they're like, it's recently, relatively recent events when it's, you know, like over 50 years ago, but I mean, there's one on ancient Greece, so I get it, right? But so a lot of how we define diagnoses today, how we think about personality and behavior today was decided during this sort of tumultuous intellectual time. So here's where they talk about that they combine the two associations. So your characters are the APA, your people attending this conference. You are going to be put on the annual conferences. And then this is something that some people do for the whole semester. We're condensing it. So when he talks about time, you can kind of ignore that, but typically about a day will be a year of a convention. There are people who your character sheet says you're part of the conference committee. So that means you actually get to help set the agenda and things along those lines. So that is something that I help with. I'm just sort of like, they call me the game master, which sounds so ominous, but basically I'm like help. And I'm a member of the conference committee. So I help with organizing all that. All right, and so this gives you some of the background of what this was like. So you pull up in front of this hotel in DC. There are no throngs of protesters, but the previous year there had been. So in San Francisco in 1970, the entrance was completely blocked by an angry crowd of gay rights activists. Individuals in the crowd personally confronting, not violently but aggressively, any member of the APA who appeared. Activists called the zapping. You found it terrifying. There are rumors that the FBI was in attendance last year, and it's almost certain they're here now, especially if you're in DC, right? And so here you can see that the Washington Post, this is an actual quote from the paper back in the 70s, back in 1970. And I love this. They out-shrieked the head shrinkers. Come on, guys. And so there were 500 psychiatrists who gathered to hear scientific studies on sexual problems. They were just as prone to antisocial behavior as anyone else. And you can see people were calling each other paranoid fool and a stupid bitch. So like not being very professional. So there were people interrupting scientific presentations. An activist named Frank Hamney grabbed the microphone and shouted, "Psychiatry is the enemy incarnate. You may take this as a declaration of war against you." And then again, like these things all actually happened. And then there was a session featuring Irving Bieber, who is one of our characters, the study of homosexuality, and a protester interrupted him. I've read your book, Dr. Bieber, and if that book talked about Black people the way it talks about homosexuals, you'd be drawn and quartered and you deserve it. And he tried to respond by claiming, "I never said they were sick. What I said is they had displaced sexual adjustment." That's the same thing, and then swears. And so we have another guy who's talking about that and getting interrupted. And then we now have this sort of not official organization, but people who are themselves gay and are allies form this little group called themselves, because it's the APA, they call themselves the Gay PA. Psychologists are bad with puns sometimes. And so there will be a symposium titled Psychiatry, Friend or Foe to Homosexuals, a Dialogue. And so we're going to have Dr. Evelyn Hooker, who has done research about this, and then a mysterious Dr. H. Anonymous, who claims to be both a licensed psychiatrist and a homosexual. Everyone knows a mentally ill person can't practice psychiatry. That's hilarious to me in modern context, y'all, because a lot of people who practice mental health field themselves struggle with mental health issues. And homosexual is a mental illness. So this Dr. H. Anonymous is risking their license. So we know ever since Kinsey's famous study that about 10% of the population identifies as homosexual. And then Hooker herself, Evelyn Hooker, published a paper in 1956 showing that these folks are actually psychologically normal. So he can't be the only one. On the other hand, we have the same folks who presented last year who are counting these data into question. So you can see we're setting up our big conflict here. In October 2 years ago, Time Magazine had a cover story on the movement among, this is the language of the time where they would just call them like the homosexuals. Now we would call them like LGBTQ plus folks, right? Where they were trying to get greater social recognition. They talked about gay bars and gay marriage. This is one of the first times that was in the public discourse. And then some of the other issues. These thoughts raise a larger specter in your mind. Are psychiatry and psychology scientific? Starting a decade ago, Thomas Szasz, professor of psychiatry at the State University of New York Health Science Center in Syracuse, has been arguing quite publicly that mental illness is a myth. His ideas challenge the very foundation of your field, understandably. He's listed on the program, and you're quite excited to get a chance to discuss his claims. The president of the APA this year is somewhat of a revolutionary himself. George Miller has been arguing of the existence of something called cognitive psychology, which directly challenges the 50-year tradition of limiting psychological research to observation, prediction, and control of human behavior. So now we're talking about the mind itself. So are psychology and psychiatry scientific? Is there such a thing as mental illness? Can or should science be used to make the world a better place? And so then it gets into some of the details here about psychology as a science. But here's what we're actually going to do. And so for us, it's each day, essentially, we kind of do a condensed version of this. We'll be doing one annual conference of the APA in the early 70s. At the beginning of each conference, you essentially, we do this again a little differently just because I've condensed it, but the conference committee will organize the agenda, the order in which people will talk. Each person will come up here to talk. So that does mean unless you have like very specific circumstances, if you have COVID, obviously we'll make an exception. But I do want people to be here in person for the days we're doing the conventions. So you come up and you give your speech, and then afterwards people can ask you questions, and fully disclosing that when I go to conferences, questions are not always questions. Sometimes they are someone's disagreement with you, right? Don't you think that, my opinion, right? So we can do that. And then, move on to the next session. So the first session of each conference will open with a presidential address. And so this person will give their presidential address, and then they're the person who just keeps us flowing, essentially. So they look at the agenda and they say, next up is so-and-so. They're kind of like an MC. And at the end of the convention, we will elect another president, and your role sheet will tell you whether or not you're supposed to run. So we have a presidential address. There might be proposals to be considered by the membership. There are symposia on topics, again, scheduled by the program committee, presenting current research. And then the board of directors, for our purposes, is just everybody. And we might talk about business and elections. And so there are some nice objectives here. You can see that different people want to accomplish, and there are some that are personal to just people. All righty. So this is my role. I'm basically just helping it run smoothly, and I usually sort of sit in the back of the classroom with like 5 things open because I'm also grading you as we go. So you can see some of the things that will be covered here. And again, these change as we go through. All right. Some of the other committees. So you might be on the research committee. And so these are the folks who are on that committee in our first year. And in that case, there are certain proposals that you will consider and say whether or not they should be allowed to do those studies, essentially. You're kind of like an IRB. There's a nomenclature committee where you're talking about the DSM and how should we define disorders? What should we call disorders? And so here are our first members of that. And then the program committee. Again, I am another member of the program committee, and I'll show you after we go through the game book how we do the program committee. And so you'll see, again, various definitions that are used. This just helps you to look at some of these things. All right, and then this is information that's public about all the characters. Okay, so there's some stuff everybody knows, but then there's some stuff that as the character will only be on your sheets, and you don't necessarily, like, for example, whoever is Dr. H Anonymous doesn't want to tell us that, right? Because otherwise it ruins the fun. I did this on Zoom 2 years ago because I was teaching on Zoom, and the person who played Dr. H Anonymous like darkened their room and had a mask on. They got really into it. It was pretty awesome. So we've got these different factions. So we've got psychoanalysts. Again, think about traditional psychoanalysis. We know from this class what that is, right? It's got some nice description of a lot of the terms we talked about. Okay, so we have that faction. And then behaviorists are our second faction. And these are true behaviorists who think that we should be studying only observable behavior. Okay, so we've got some folks in that faction as well, looking at learning principles, things along those lines. And then we have the cognitivists, like our first president, George Miller. And so they are rejecting that we could only study observable behavior. They're saying, no, we need to know what people are thinking, and that really matters. So like the behaviorists and the cognitivists are sort of two branches of cognitive social learning theory that we covered pretty recently. So here are the people who are psychoanalysts. We do not have all of the characters in our game just because the game is like an extended remix. You can do up to 26 people, I think, if we don't have that many folks. So over the weekend, I will make a chart of who's playing what character and send that out to y'all so you know who you're going to collaborate with. And we're also going to have a lot of time next week for you all to like conference in class with the other members of your factions. So not only will you have like psychoanalysts, behaviorists, cognitivists, but if you're a member of the gay PA, you'll probably want to talk to each other, right? But we do have Socrates and Beaver, for example. They're two characters. For sure, we have a Spiegel, a Bandura, a Harlow, a Hooker. That sounds weird out of context. Fully acknowledging that the poor woman's name was problematic. Noam Chomsky, George Miller. And then we have some people who are like, I don't really go with any of those factions, which again really relates to real psychology. So like Anastasi and Clark, folks like that, Fryer, Giddings, folks like along those lines, Thomas Saz, Leona Tyler. We don't have a Zimbardo, although I don't know if I've ever gotten enough people to have a Zimbardo because he's like the last character you add, but I feel like he would be really fun to play. There's some stuff about ethics of research for the folks on the research committee, APA standards. There's like a history of psychology. Again, we've learned a lot of this semester, right? So you guys have a nice amount of background on this. And it just keeps going. All right, so these give you some tips about actually playing your role, specifically for this game. So the APA did grant membership to women. It did take a while for all psychological organizations to have that happen. So like Christine Ladd Franklin and Mary Whitten Calkins would like sneak into other meetings and like they'd either hide under the table or they'd like wear mustaches so they could hear things. But the APA was actually fairly progressive. And so it's interesting again to be kind of navigating this, right? Where we're gonna feel like from our modern perspective, the views on LGBTQ plus people are not progressive in an organization that purports to be, right? One of the things that ends up debating in this game is whether or not psychologists should speak out on political issues and take political stances. So for example, people spoke out against Barry Goldwater when he ran for president. So they have resolutions related to that. There's resolutions related to Roe v. Wade, for example. I believe we might have written an amicus brief for that one as well. And so there's information about classification of mental illness and how that's changed over time up until this moment in the 70s. And they show some of the diagnoses here and what they used to be called. So this is from 1880. These were like all the mental illnesses, essentially. Yeah.
Barry Goldwater, president, senator?
I think so. Yeah.
After that, I was like, I know the name, I think there's like a scandal related to.
There is, yep. All right, so we've got stuff about Freud in here, all the stuff we know about him already. And then to start talking about the DSM, right? So I believe the revision that is happening during our conference is the DSM-3. But there had been a 1 and 2 before that. And again, here are sort of how things were laid out. Traumatic psychoses. I mean, this is what we would call post PTSD now, basically, right? Some sort of strange language we're not quite used to, obviously. But, you know, Huntington's, brain tumor, alcohol-related psychoses, manic depressive is what we used to call bipolar. Dementia praecox was an early term for schizophrenia. And things along those lines. And then you'll see that we have other nomenclature, classifications, how we start to break down even just psychoses and things along those lines. So we're getting more disorders, we're getting them more articulated, things along those lines. And so you think about disorders caused by or associated with impairment of brain tissue, mental deficiency, disorders of psychogenic origin, things along those lines. And so again, you could see it started to get like more and more scientific. And I believe some of these codes that they came up with for DSM-2 are like still used. Might be true. So things like personality disorders, things along those lines. They're talking about use of medications coming into play, right? So psychiatrists are going to be involved in that. And then talking about homosexuality and how it was viewed in America. And one thing that I'll say is that this is a very colonial perspective, right? This focuses on the settlers who came over, but the vast majority of indigenous peoples, native peoples who were here prior to colonization had terms for like people who were two-spirit, people who had both male and female parts of themselves. So just know that this is a very white way of looking at things. But it talks about the history, talks about the Kinsey studies we just referenced in more details. And then it talks about Hooker's research more. So Hooker is obviously an important character here. There's a nice history of Stonewall here. If you don't know about Stonewall, it really was sort of a turning point in LGBTQ rights. It talks a little bit about like linguistics and research methods. So again, this is all just background information that depending on your character, portions of this are going to be more or less applicable. So like if your character is supposed to propose a research proposal, this is going to be more helpful, right? Than if your person is not doing that. And then there are some excerpts and the primary source stuff as well. So just to sort of remind you all how we are going to do this in our course, I'm going to pull up the syllabus schedule. So let me zoom in so we can actually read it. So today we're just talking about how to do it. On Monday, come to class to check in, and then, you know, if you just want to stay here and use your laptop to look at things, you can do that. If you're someone who works better actually like going through physical things in the library, you can do that. And I will be here to answer any questions you have individually, help guide you, things along those lines. On Wednesday, each of you will meet with me individually. So obviously this will be real quick, but essentially to ask questions about your character, for me to emphasize the things that are really important for your character to get done. And so we're all ready and prepared. And then the day before Thanksgiving break, we're going to do our first day of simulation. Our first year, we're going to see how that goes. And then when you get back, we'll have our second day, and then we'll have a work day to regroup and strategize a couple more days. And then on our exam time, we finish it. So the big thing, the first big thing you have due is the abstract for what you will present. And so let me go back to our defining the mind section. So you are going to come up with an abstract for the speech you'll give in the convention. You turn that in two places. One is here on Blackboard as an assignment that I'll grade you on and give you points for. And the other is if you follow this Google link, you just copy paste the same thing and answer some questions about it. And that goes to the program committee. So this is all on Blackboard. And if you're at our homepage on the left side, third thing down, defining the mind. And everything is right here for the game.
Yeah, but where is the second? Oh, the second one.
Yep, right there. And so again, your character sheet will tell you what you're supposed to be doing. So some people might have to give more than one speech. The speeches don't have to be any more than 5 minutes. Pretty low key, some of them might be shorter, but everybody does have to give at least one speech. But if, let's say, you are supposed to run for president and then you win, you'll also give your presidential address in addition to your campaign speech, right? And maybe you're supposed to do those, but also like do a research presentation. And some people have combined those in the past, or some people have done all three. But you all have to do at least one. And then you should be actively involved throughout the rest of the game, asking other people questions. When we come to like the business portion of our meeting, we're debating proposals, then you should, in your character, say, you know, well, I don't think we should do this, or I think this is a great proposal. So for example, there's the Leona Tyler proposal where she will propose that psychologists should be allowed to be involved in political issues. And each of your people may or may not have a pretty strong opinion on that. So the abstract is the first thing you have due. That also gets you set up to do your speech. The abstract is not your whole speech. The abstract's only 200 words. If you were to give a speech that's 200 words, it's probably about 30 seconds, right? So you want to flesh it out a little more. And this is where the library research can really come in handy. A lot of these folks, you'll be able to find stuff they actually wrote. You'll be able to find nice detailed websites about them, things along those lines, and that'll help you make your speech. The next thing you'll have due is a summary. And I believe this is due, yeah, this is due while I'm away. So you'll have a whole class day to work on it. And our classroom will still be available, so if you and your coalition want to come in when I'm not here and work together, you can do that. But where you will turn in this summary, and the summary is your individual strategy for the game. So you're going to give us some background on your individual. We're going to give me, this is only going to me. Your individual's opinions about important issues, your strategy for the simulation. What speeches are you going to make? Who are you going to try to work with? What do you want to try to get accomplished? How that individual strategy fits with the strategy of others. So are you working with others in a coalition? Are you a lone wolf and you don't kind of care what everybody else is doing, right? And then you get points just for like spell checking. So that is just to, again, set you up and have you ready to go before our simulation starts the the following Monday. So then you get graded on your speech, the content of it, how well you give it, but then also you get graded on just like your frequency of participation throughout the convention itself. So no one will be at their speech grade until the last day of the convention, although I'll have them sort of scored. And if you don't give a speech, you get a 0. So don't do that to yourself because it's 80 points. And then the very last thing that you'll have due at the time of our exam, basically, and I think this date is wrong, so I'll fix that. Yeah, it's the 9th, not the 7th. But is a summary of what this was like, referencing the materials you referenced for your initial thing. Did what happened actually relate to real life? And your reaction to doing this. And that is due after we do our last day of the simulation. So like at midnight, the day of our exam. So after our exam period would be over. So you have some time to. What's that? No, no. You have taken your last exam for this class. So this is your final, basically, is working on this. Monday's your first work day, so come on in, check in with me, and then if you prefer to go to the library, you can do that. If you prefer to be here, that works too. Other questions, comments, things along those lines? Did anybody not get their character assignment?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, yeah, shoot me an email and I can resend it, or just see if I missed sending it.
Yeah.
If you want, you can, definitely. I think every year the person who is Dr. X has at least worn a mask, which has been pretty cool. But yeah, if you want to, like, you're playing a male character and you want to wear a suit, feel free. When I did them, I did much more period ones when I was at the conference. So like I played the head of like a salon in the revolution in France. And so I wore like really long dresses and my hair up and whatnot. And there was a guy who wore like a full-on like Marie Antoinette wig, which was hilarious. So you can get as into it or not as you want, basically. All right, I am gonna just stick around. So if people want to ask individual questions, you can. And if not, you can start your weekend a little early and start thinking about this.
Okay, so this is the email I got from you. Where does it say?
Right there.
So this is.
That your role, please. If
Right.
you are this person, but you
Okay.
can incorporate stuff in the other person, we don't have one.
Okay, so I'm there. Okay, got it.
Yes,
Okay.
you're Barbara, but you can incorporate some.
Okay, I really bad. I just told you this
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
So how was I supposed to do that? I don't know.
Yeah, so for you, I believe you're on a symposium with other people, so that
Okay.
might help.
Yeah.
Sitting with your classmates.
Okay,
Um,
and where do I find who I've worked
It'll be in your,
in this?
so it'll tell you what you're supposed to do and something to give you scroll down. Yeah, it'll give you like your goals and things, and it'll give you some sources to look at.
Okay,
So yeah, they'll your specific assignments, so they'll tell you who to work with for that.
okay, like names of people in our class.
It will be their character names, and I'll
Oh,
send
okay.
out the
The-
chart, the
got it.
weekend, so you
Okay.
know you're in the first.
I'm gonna email my question.
Yeah, I have to go back to the other.
I want the abstract written down, but like that's a good title.
Oh,
Yeah, that'd be great if you don't mind sending me, then I can go look at exactly what you're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah, we have,
Because I just know, I need to compare like men
Oh,
and
yeah.
women.
Sure.
Like I need them, I feel like I need.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and the really interesting, I'll send you both, but the like muscle dysmorphia, you're finding more and more women at that too.
I think Because I was thinking when you asked me the one, like, I feel like it would be useful to have like. both.
Yeah, they totally can, yeah, because, so. A lot, if you think about like Instagram fitness model.
Yeah.
Right, like there's a lot of pressure on women to be like told now, and like they look at that as much.
Yeah, lots of them are like it's looking out, so that's, yeah, okay.
So yeah, I'll send you both, but yeah, send me your paper and then we'll trigger.
Okay.
Send it to you. Perfect.
Sure. I was wondering, I'm not thinking I want to be.
Yeah, same.
It's,
Yeah, so you're getting this. I don't remember which one I assigned you, give me a sec here. But I'll email me and be like, which one am I? Because you're one, I think you might be Peter, and then someone else is Brady, basically, all right. You and one other person rated a 5 on my graduating. So yeah, that's what I did, you guys, this time. But yeah, I will, keep the email and I will send it to you. Yeah, the first time I did this game, I was like, oh, well, it's one character, yeah, but it's like that's still in the outside, so now I. It's okay, it's Brooke. I think Brooke was the other one. Yeah, she usually says like, here, she's been on.
So do you find that people love doing this?
Oh, yeah, people
Yeah.
are exactly like you are right now,
Okay.
terrified.
Yeah.
And then as soon as you get into it, you're like, oh, this is fun.
And so the first part of the abstract, you want 200 words of just like overall what we're gonna say.
Yeah, so like, this is, it doesn't even have to be full 200 words, it's
Okay.
like, this is what my speech is gonna be about.
Okay.
And it's basically to help the program committee organize people on it.
Okay.
So like, when I submit to a conference, I have to write out an abstract saying like, this is what I would talk about, here's my docs.
Okay, okay, cool.
And then that abstract is printed in the book, so that other people can read and do all of it goes in that book.
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, yeah, and like I said, there'll be 2 whole days to ask more questions, I give a lot of lead time because people get really anxious, which is fine, it's different
Yeah.
than other stuff you guys have done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is the exam too by the end of the day?
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't even like, I